Welcome back to Air Quality Matters. We already have the tools and knowledge we need to make a difference to the quality of the air we breathe in our built environment. The conversations we have and how we share what we know is the key to our success. I'm Simon Jones, and coming up, a conversation with Olivia Swan, a welcome early career fellow at the Centre of Medical Informatics at the Usher Institute and a paediatric infectious disease consultant in Edinburgh, and Dan Bowers, head of psychology at the University of South Wales. It was recorded on location at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow from a symposium on healthy net zero housing and the role of digitisation. We talk about echo chambers in the built environment, and I don't mean the physical ones, but the literal ones. Or is it the other way around? I can't remember. Anyway, I sat down with two experts from entirely different fields, accidental interlopers, as they put it, in the built environment, but with the same interest at heart: people, us, humans at the centre of the built environment. I wonder sometimes if we haven't been getting this wrong, that we have seen the challenges of air quality as an engineering problem and not the human one that it might be. There are some fascinating insights here from the perspectives of health and behaviour, and perhaps a reflection of the interdisciplinary approach that will ultimately be required to move the needle. We were all a bit frazzled at the end of an intense couple of days, and it seems everyone there had either proposals to finish off or submit, or events to organise the next day, on top of the 2 days itself. So I couldn't have been more grateful for Dan and Livy to share their time with me. I think this was a really great conversation, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Please don't forget to check out the sponsors in the show notes and at airqualitymatters.net. This is a conversation with Olivia Swan and Dan Bowers. I suppose for listeners joining us, I've pulled you two poor souls out of 2 days worth of symposium and workshops, and we're all a bit frazzled. So we'll keep it short and sweet today. But I thought, because of the theme of the conference, which has been this kind of looking at multidisciplinary approaches to the built environment and this kind of net zero drive, health that we're increasingly tying into our built environment, but also importantly these digital data sets and how we use data and technology in that equation as well. That's what the theme of these 2 days have been about, and I thought the value of pulling Livy and Dan out particularly was you're from those multidisciplines as we talk about it.
Definitely interlopers.
Yeah, interlopers in the built environment, and I think that's a really fascinating perspective to look at, to say, right, okay, what is the view from the outside into the built environment, and what are the fields that you're doing that has this connection to the built environment? So probably the best place to start is, and I don't normally do this because people would normally be within our sectors, they'd have a good idea of who you are, but perhaps explain a little bit about who you are and what you do and what this connection is, particularly to this type of topic. So maybe we start with you, Livy, about where you come from and what you're doing.
Yeah, so I'm Olivia Swan. I am a children's doctor and a data scientist, and I work in the hospital, in Children's Hospital in Edinburgh, but mostly in the University of Edinburgh, in the Usher Institute. So I'm here because I was fed up. I'm here because I was fed up of seeing the same children again and again who were coming in with respiratory problems, respiratory infections or wheeze, and whose parents were telling me that their homes were cold and damp and that they couldn't afford to heat them, or that they were having troubles kind of getting their home to a standard that they were comfortable with. But then also another group of parents who were telling us that they had interventions in their homes. They had, for example, kind of insulation, and things hadn't got better, they got worse. So it kind of sent me down on a bit of a journey as I say, a data scientist as well as a doctor. So I wear a lot of hats, but I knew that if I could find the right data sets and bring them together, that I could try and answer some of these questions and try and avoid these children coming back again and again. So I don't know if you want me to say a bit more just now.
No, I think that's brilliant. I mean, I was looking at your title and I got the paediatric doctor part, but the data scientist part, there was quite a bit in that title. Perhaps unpack a little bit about what you're doing in data science.
So I'm a nerd, I code. Okay. And I love it when people say, well, you don't look like a data scientist, because I think we need more women in data science, and I think we need more medics in data science. I think we need more paediatricians in data science. So actually knowing what you can do once you've got one data set, you can link it to another data set, and then if you've got the clinical knowledge behind you, you can then work out what questions you can answer from those data sets. So I'm a medical doctor, but I also have done a PhD. In fact, my PhD was in malaria, was completely different. So my specialty is infectious disease, paediatric infectious disease. So I did my specialty, a PhD in malaria, having worked in Malawi. And then during COVID, I kind of moved to data science. I learned how to code on my sofa during lockdown because there was some data that needed analysing, and I just...
As you do.
As you do.
Learn to code.
I promise you, if I can learn to code, anybody can learn to code. So that's what I do.
I guess you're a rare breed, are you, in medicine, data scientist?
Well, I think there's probably, I think I am for my vintage, but I think there's more of us coming through because I think that we're really beginning to realise the value of data science in clinical medicine, and the fact that if you can speak both languages, if you can understand the clinical problems and you can actually work out how to look at them with, the huge amount of data that society is generating, exponentially at the moment, that actually that's really powerful. Because if you go into big data sets without the clinical knowledge, there is a danger that you can make assumptions or you can ask questions that don't make clinical sense. They don't make. So having both of those things is great, and it's certainly becoming more of the part of the undergraduate curriculum in Edinburgh and in other medical schools in the UK.
So was it that interest in data that joined some of those dots between the built environment and the illnesses that you were seeing, or was it more anecdotal and typical kind of symptomatic conversations with parents and families that were joining those, or combination?
So it was a combination. So it was certainly it was set off by the patients that I met in the emergency department, the patients that I saw in the wards again and again, as I say, kind of recognising the same faces and having these conversations with families about what was going on in the background. And we've spoken today as well about the fact that as medics, we're not really trained to talk so much about housing. We in our training we are taught to ask about smoking, we're taught to ask about occupations, but actually we've never really been that focused on what somebody's home environment is. And as a child, or particularly the group that I'm looking at, which are preschool children, they spend so much time at home that it's to not ask about it is to only get a tiny fraction of the story. So,
yeah, interesting. Yeah. And what about you, Dan? How did you kind of, what's your background? What did you do? Is the first question, I suppose, and then where's this connection with housing come from and technology?
So I'm Dan Bowers. I'm head of psychology at the University of South Wales, and I lead a fairly newly formed research network that we've established over the last 12 months in South Wales, really, this was drawn from a kind of strategic decision we took as a department, which was we should be outside of the four walls of the university more than we're in it as much as possible, and trying to be impactful and doing things. And so we started proactively trying to make friends. And then we, by accident, made lots of friends in housing. And the more we spoke to people, the more we realised that actually there's just psychology everywhere in terms of the work that they were trying to do. And in particular, social housing was a real focus for us. Through doing some projects with them, looking at things like the reintegration into shared kind of communal living for older people after COVID. So people had locked down in their rooms ostensibly, and then the purpose of living somewhere like an extra care scheme is that you come back together and you've got a community and you're not isolated or lonely. Well, actually after COVID that was quite hard. So we did some projects like that, and then got introduced to people in the NHS and started talking to people from Gareth Morgan from Howard Our Health Board has been particularly kind of interesting because he is doing a Bevan Exemplar project on housing and health and the intersection between the two. So I remember having a conversation with him, and he was talking about, someone should really set something up around, in Wales for bringing those bits of the world together. So naively, we said, oh, we'll have a go at that. Oh yeah, come on, let's go. And so we did, and then from there we've done a series of kind of things around figuring out who we are and what we should be. So November 23, we ran a consensus event which brought together all of our new friends, ostensibly. So we brought everyone together, and within that you had Welsh Gov, people like Community Housing Cymru, Public Health Wales, range of different housing associations, all in the same room. And we said, right, so you've told us health and housing, it's a big intersection. What should we be looking at? Tell us what we should prioritise. And we sort of forced them through the mangle. So we used these consensus techniques for a day and said, right, you need to make some decisions, and these are the ways we might use that, we might get you to that point. And by the end of the day, what we had was 5 priority areas, and that really forms like what we do. So there's thriving as a function of your housing in your community. There's evidencing housing as a precursor to or predictor of health outcomes. Technology and AI, which is where this stuff comes in. Physical needs now and in the future for social housing. So in Wales, you've got lots of very hard to adapt properties, like, lots of miners' cottages in South Wales valleys that getting a wheelchair through the front door is not that easy. Getting it so you can turn it around in the corridor even harder. And then one around trying to find ways to integrate the different players in the sector. So we are pretty early on in that journey. We've delivered a couple of projects. The one that I was here talking about today was looking at technology acceptance in social housing. And obviously there's a world of kind of new stuff happening there where new technologies are being embedded in social housing. And not necessarily out of the active choice of the tenant. And if you look at technology acceptance generally, that's not necessarily the best way to approach getting people to want and engage with something. So we've been really interested in looking at that, and also kind of the process by which that happens across the sector. Because fundamentally what happens at the end is you've got a tenant who is probably talking to a neighbourhood officer who is saying, oh, you're going to have this new piece of technology and it's going to go in and it's going to do this for you. But then, how you track that back and how you maintain a feedback loop back to the design stage and kind of keep that system all conversing back and forth is really challenging. And what that leads to then is a lot of disengagement at the front end. People saying, I don't understand what this is. People saying, I don't really want to have it. And that's a challenge because clearly technology's got a massive role to play and could be doing brilliant things. But how that happens is really of interest to us.
So it sounds like there's quite an intersection even within your two disciplines of psychology and health in behaviour and habits and interactions with the environment and adoption and changes in behaviour. It's quite a heady mix before you bring the building into the equation even.
Yeah. Definitely, and I think as an example, just in terms of kind of the movement in medicine over the past kind of probably 20, 30 years, from a kind of paternalistic, this is what you should be doing, to actually kind of working with the patient as a partner in their own care, has been like really phenomenal. It's been really, really strong. So actually moving from telling people what to do to actually ensuring that people have control and autonomy in their health decisions. So that, I think, speaks to a lot of the stuff that we are doing in medicine. And it sounds like actually there's a lot of that learning that can be can be built to the built environment as well, in terms of digital technology.
I've had this conversation with medical practice. I had a guy called John McKeown on who's quite prolific in kind of healthcare and ventilation. Very similar story to you. He was an A&E consultant, was just fed up with dealing with constant, I think it was allergies mainly, asthmatic type allergies that were constantly coming across his desk, and he was going, it's got to be something that would tell me why the building isn't a good story for this picture, kind of a wake-up call, much like yourself. But he was talking about this change in the move from this deference to medical professions to more of a partnership process, but that changes everything from the psychology to the communications to how we interact with people. Much more analogous to what we're talking about here with the built environment as well, is that everything is changing in that sense, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you're the psychologist, so I'm not going. I'll stay in my lane. But I think
Please
it's. Yeah, that's true. That's what these days have been about, haven't they? Everyone just mingling. But so in my kind of daily job, I work with children with all sorts of different infections. So I work with children with tuberculosis, with HIV, all sorts of things. And if you don't have that long-standing relationship with patients going forward, if you don't have that trust and they don't understand why you're asking certain things of them, they just won't do it, even if they, even if you can see why they should. So those long-term relationships, particularly for the patients who've got lifelong or hard to treat illnesses, is really, really important. So it's the same thing with a house. Do you know, you're not going to pop in and out of a house. You're going to live there for quite some time. So, having that same level of trust and autonomy, and trust is what we spoke about yesterday as well, didn't we?
Yeah, and I think people aren't necessarily rational actors, right? They're not receiving information from a doctor or from a social housing, from a landlord, and because they're telling you, oh, this is right and this is the evidence and this is why you should have this, it's not necessarily how people are really responding to that in practice. And trust is massive in that. It's huge in that. And it's also about what the relevant others in that kind of situation think as well. So it's, what do your friends think about this new technology? Or is anyone else in your community using this technology? Have they had a good experience? Have they had a bad experience? Did it cost them more money or did they save money? These are all factors that are inherently social and psychological that are going to influence people's decision making, the degree to which they adopt new technology, the degree to which they kind of adapt to and engage with it, that go beyond whether it works, which is important, and it shouldn't be there if it doesn't work, but fundamentally it's one of a number of complex factors which will drive engagement.
And we talked about these ideas as being infectious, didn't we? Which I really like that. I really like kind of comes full circle, these kind of infectious ideas of your peers and your your neighbourhood or your kind of family's experiences of all these things. And there's so much of that in medicine as well, in terms of kind of building trust with different communities too. But
consensus and resonance and nudge theory and there's all of these things at play that move the dial for people.
The other interesting thing on that we spoke about today was the fact that sometimes people may find it hard to make decisions for themselves, but actually they can find it easier to make decisions to benefit people that they love. So children being a really good example of a group who are, who rely on their families and caregivers to keep them safe, but actually being able to just not to use children, that's the wrong word, but like to actually kind of be able to enable people to make kind of better decisions, not just for themselves, but for other people that they love, actually can be more powerful and more effective.
But I think the interesting thing about children is the agency thing. I mean, children are one of the cohorts that don't have control over the environment that they're in, whether we're talking, like, say, about schools or whether we're talking about home. So there is that potential that to leave on the people that do have control of that environment. So there's an imperative to do it anyway, because ultimately a child isn't going to be able to spend money to improve ventilation in their own home or to open windows in the morning when they get up and things like that. So we have to act on behalf of children particularly. So they're a really fascinating cohort in that sense. And I think anybody that's a parent understands the do as I say, not as I do mentality to parenting. So there is an element of you can direct behaviour in a way that you can then go down the pub and flatly ignore later on.
And I know I've said this kind of till I'm blue in the face these 2 days, but just for the benefit of your listeners as well, in terms of the importance of children as little canaries in the coal mine for this problem. So preschool children almost as a barometer of housing quality, because they are really impacted in terms of their indoor air quality and in terms of the kind of damp and mould, in terms of the pollutants and things. Small babies breathe very fast. They can breathe up to 60 times a minute compared to 12 to 15 times a minute for grown-ups. They are at a point where their immune systems and their lungs are developing, and we know that if you have lots of respiratory infections early on in your life, you're more likely to develop asthma as a grown-up and you're more likely to die early from a respiratory problem, which is really sobering. So it's a lifelong thing we're setting folk up for. And respiratory infections are the most common problem they're the biggest cause of admissions in paediatrics, full stop. Do you know? So they're the biggest cause of antibiotic use in this age group. And they're really for families to actually look after children who have respiratory infections. And I'm kind of including kind of wheezy kind of viral infections with that as well. Then having to take time off from work to look after your kids as well is really disruptive, and depending on what your job is, you can if you're in a precarious situation, can be like financially a big problem too. So it's massive.
Yeah, there's some interesting angles there. The canary is a really interesting analogy because these sentient animals that we've used over time have always been very good markers for predisposing potential health risks. And we know that smaller animals, and birds in particular, do suffer from respiratory conditions much earlier, and we can see that. But we also see that in cats and dogs and smaller animals. And the point you make about children is very true. And it's not just that they breathe more, it's their dose ratio is higher because they weigh less, so that while they're breathing more, their dose response is much more than we experience.
I mean, I could go on about this forever. There's loads of other things as well in terms of, so smaller children have, that their breathing tubes are smaller. So if you imagine if you get a bit of a wheezy episode with a cough or a cold, your breathing tube is a decent size. Your trachea, your bronchi, which are the ones that branch off, they're all pretty decent size. So if they get bunged up with a bit of what's basically snot, kind of mucus and snot, it's not a big problem. But actually, thinking back to physics, kind of your diameter of kind of radius and your flow, the very radius of your bronchus, if it's already small to start with and you stick a plug of mucus in it or it gets inflamed, you're in big trouble because that flow is disproportionately impacted. So these little babies with little breathing tubes have a massive impact.
And when we talk about this impact on later life, one of the things we now know, particularly with things like particulate matter, that is it's a multi-systemic disease. We now know that particles can transfer across every cell tissue in the body, which means we're setting up the foundations for poor systemic illnesses, chronic illnesses in later life. It's a bit like a mortgage. The earlier you start, the more you end up with at the end. Very similar, I think, to chronic exposure to environmental conditions. The earlier you start saving those pollutants up, the harder it's going to hit later on, and that's the challenge with kids. So I think it's unique. But with kids particularly, there's also a really interesting psychological element to it because there's codependence, and lots of different stakeholders involved in the environments that they're operating in. As we were talking about today, they can also be the most engaged.
Yeah, and I think that's wonderful. I don't know, do you want to talk about that? Because I think that is really, some of the examples today from Danny Brown were...
Yeah, they were great. Yeah, kids as kind of climate scientists and air quality scientists, and them being the drivers of it and taking those messages back to their house to say, actually, we really need to take care of this stuff. Absolutely brilliant. I think one of the things that's really interesting in terms of air quality, though, is I'm not sure that people are necessarily seeing it as the risk that it is in practice. And I would be interested, it's a study that I've been formulating over the last couple of days whilst we've been here, in getting people to almost rank what they think the health risks are in terms of their perception of them. And I wonder where indoor air quality in particular comes, because home psychologically is safe, nice, I control it, it's my environment, it's not the dirty road because that's outside, that's over there somewhere. My house is my house and I look after it and it's mine. So.
And you said earlier, excuse me, and as you said earlier, it smells nice.
Yeah, it's mine. Yeah, I look after it. Yeah, it's dust.
We were having that conversation the other evening where I said actually a lot of the things that generate risk or are associated with risk indoors, we associate actually with positive reinforcement. The smell of an open fire, candles, incense burners, fresh deodorants and cleaning products, cooking. Yeah, we know cooking is the biggest generator of particulate matter. That smell of bacon wafting up the stairs in the morning is actually the smell of polyaromatic hydrocarbons and particulate matter wafting up the stairs, you know, so we just, there's not that association. So it is a fascinating, you know, we were discussing at length, like, where is that disconnect? Because the evidence suggests, certainly at a public health level, that when we talk about things like DALYs, and listeners of the podcast that recall kind of Ben Jones and Max Sherman's stuff around harm intensities, we kind of can associate DALYs of about 2,200 years lost to death and disability per 100,000 of the population, which is equivalent to smoking and twice as harmful as alcoholism and road traffic deaths. So it's right up there at the, this is an intolerable level of risk, yet almost zero funding comparatively to those other other risk factors in dealing with the problem. And there's this weird psychological thing that I was talking to you about, that this chronic esoteric nature of air quality, that people just can't quite join the dots, change simple behaviours to mitigate long-term risk.
Because it's invisible?
Because it's invisible, and we were talking about the fact that because it's a basic instinct to take a breath, you basically, you don't have agency to make a choice not to breathe. So I think somehow there's a mental wiring going on that makes people not think about air quality because they just simply don't have a choice. They have to breathe. And I think that perhaps extends in then to some of the longer term chronic risk mitigation. Because I can't see any other way of painting it. We know it's the same with radon. You can't give a radon test away. You know, and there isn't I joke, it's the slam dunkiest of dunky air quality pollutants, because we know the source, we know the harm it causes, we can measure it cheaply, we can solve the problem. Like there isn't a pollutant that has a more direct straight line to a particular health outcome than radon. And we know, and it can't be mistaken for anything else, and we can measure it easily. And yet we're still sitting here today with radon in people's homes.
But again, that's where the psychology comes into that. You know, the reality is that there are probably 4 or 5 more visible, easier to comprehend, more well-known, understood about, talked about, socialized, you know, as being acceptable, go and do some exercise, or unacceptable, smoking. Whereas this, I don't think that this has reached the public consciousness in quite the same way. And I think like that's probably a big part of the shift that would be required here. And I'm talking as a relative outsider, you know, thinking about how it might work together. But the reality is that what a lot of the behavioural change that might be required to improve a lot of this stuff is, it's another chore in the day for people. You've got to open your windows, you've got to, you know, make sure you're ventilating this, you've got to not use that, you've got to... and I would be interested to kind of quantify that in people's experiences of their daily lives. So if you think, you know, you've got to get up, you've got to, you know, get your kids out of bed, you've got to get their school uniform ready, you've got to do the dishes, you've got to unpack the dishwasher from the night before. All of a sudden, you know...
Telling me now I've got to put the cooker hood on.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So here are 3 or 4 other things that you need to fold in because you have to do this. But if people are seeing this as the 6th, 7th, 8th most important health thing, and they're already eating well, and they're already doing exercise, and they already have stopped smoking, and they're already cut down on their drinking, it's hard then to motivate people to go again and build the next one.
But you must see that in health all the time. I mean, you know, you're talking about the difference between preventative health and active health measures, and again, you're competing for people's times to change dietary behaviours, cleaning behaviours, you know, whatever the behaviours that might be putting them at risk for, you know, respiratory conditions, for example, changing hoovering in a different way or whatever it is. So there's a lot of experience, isn't there, on the ground at a kind of a public health measure of how do we get these ideas to compete in a way and compete for people's bandwidth?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe compete is the wrong word, because I think I mean, certainly there are definitely times when in clinic we kind of try and focus on one thing at one point, you know, kind of to, you know, for until I see you next, this is the one thing I really want you to try and do. You know, I know that you've got lots on your plate, but this is the one thing. So I guess having different things that are important at different times is maybe one way forward. But I think I would respectfully disagree with you, Dan, that actually I think that the public consciousness of indoor air quality is rising, and I think part of that has been the tragic case of Bishak and the visibility of damp and mould as one of the kind of proxies for indoor air quality within that sphere of kind of that we can talk about it. So I think that has made people very aware. So, you know, I don't normally get people coming and chatting to me about my research at the school gates, but, you know, people want to know, they really want to talk about it, and everybody has a story. And I think that actually, I would agree that we need to work as a community on our narrative in terms of trying to kind of to get almost the PR of indoor air quality and housing conditions, kind of just to find it a way that is not nagging, that is going to get that message out there. But I do think that people are really ready to hear it and want to make changes where they have agency. So that's the other thing.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about damp and mould is that there's a couple of villains in the pieces with damp and mould that we don't have with some of the other air quality. One is cost. There's a physical maintenance cost associated with damp and mould that you don't have with particulate matter necessarily, or high levels of NOx in a space. You don't have to wipe your walls down or redecorate because of NOx, you know, traffic pollution in a bedroom. The other thing about damp and mould, going back to kind of basic instinct stuff, is that we are predisposed to be fearful of mould. Rightly so. We've avoided eating and consuming things that look furry and green for good reason. Like, we understand that is not a good...
We've evolved.
We've evolved to understand, you know, mouldy, slimy stuff is not good. So I think there's that. So that's, I think that that's a good lever. It's like you say, it can often be a proxy. And I always say that, you know, if you've got high levels of damp and mould in a property, it's going to keep bad company. There are going to be you're likely underventilating the space, you're likely to be exposed to other pollutants too. And we've all, I know any of us that have been in these damp and mould and properties know they're invariably associated with high levels of deodorants and bleach smells and disinfectors, because people are trying to manage it and are exposed to those as well at an unhealthy level. You know, you walk out of properties and you feel it in your sinuses and in your lungs, and you can feel sick. Like, they're really awful places to be, some of them. So this stuff really matters.
Yeah, it absolutely does.
I'd like to borrow your attention for just a moment to discuss Aico, a partner of this podcast. Aico, an EI company, specialises in pioneering new technologies in fire, carbon monoxide alarms and Internet of Things technology. Many know them as the go-to company for these products. In fact, this year they're celebrating 35 years in business. I particularly know them for their outstanding work in the housing sector with their HomeLink offerings, aiming to solve some of the industry's most serious challenges. The technology incorporates environmental sensors and a gateway to offer connected home solutions, which has a proven track record in helping landlords reduce operational costs and carbon emissions while improving residents' well-being and safety. Issues at the heart of the housing sector, like damp and mould, fuel poverty, and energy efficiency, are all in the crosshairs of Aico. I've been amazed at how they are innovating here, with a laser focus on unpacking some of the complex nature of these challenges in a way that answers the what next question we so desperately need at the moment. They have a great network of experts and installers. If you're in housing, they are definitely worth talking to. Trusted is an overused word, but not here. Ask around, and Aico are synonymous with it. Details are in the show notes and at airqualitymatters.net and at Aico. That's aico.co.uk. Now, back to the podcast.
I don't think I kind of mentioned in terms of the actual work that we're doing at the moment, it just kind of put that into context and what other insights we hopefully can get from the study that I'm running, which is the Homes, Heat and Healthy Kids study, which is linking up children's healthcare data with individual property level data, so you can see every home that they've ever lived in. So we're asking some of those questions together on a high level. So the first one, we're focusing on first on underheated homes, so on cold, damp homes, then looking to see how many respiratory infections we think are due to that, so that could be avoided if every home was properly heated, and then moving on to kind of almost a proxy for air quality, so looking at the different retrofitting approaches for homes across Scotland, and this is 4 million child years and 250,000 homes across Scotland. So looking at ways that have been undertaken to make homes warmer, or to kind of to reduce the chance of primarily warmer. Is that increased air tightness in some of those situations? Is that then associated with worse respiratory outcomes? So though your homes are warmer, you're increasing the air tightness, you're trapping in the mold, the smoke, the viruses, the particulate matter, everything else. So we should. That's what the study that I'm running at the moment is focusing on, and it will be very broad, very high level. But I think it's actually going to help us look again at what we were talking about before, about these bringing together health and housing and showing the co-benefits of some of these some of the interventions. So can we find the best way to reduce fuel poverty, to reduce carbon emissions, meet our net zero targets, and make kids healthier? Brilliant. Do you know? I'd buy that.
Yeah, sure.
So that's there are so many overlaps, and I appreciate that dampness is sometimes thought of as separate to indoor air quality, but I think that actually we really need to consider them all together. So.
Yeah, and it's a good marker as well. Yeah, and I was interested in the work that you were doing, Dan. 'Cause you touched on it, but I'd like to unpack it a little bit more. And this was this adoption piece with technology and data and in housing in particular. Is this when we're asking people to accept a air quality monitor or a change of ventilation system or a heat pump going in, all of these things that have these potential impacts. There's a journey we've got to take people on that often starts well before a plumber turns up at your door with a piece of gear, sticking it in, going, I'm here to install the so-and-so. Tell me a little bit about that work and some of the things you were kind of finding when you were looking into these, like how are people getting to the point of knowing what they're getting, and where is it failing and where is it succeeding?
Yeah, so this is really new. So we did this last month, so we're kind of trawling through the data now, hot off the data. Yeah. So what we were interested in was mapping the process. So this falls back on a piece of research we did a couple of years ago. One of my PhD students for a PhD was looking at the technology acceptance for a new powered wheelchair controller. And what she ended up doing was a grounded theory which mapped across all the different stakeholders, across almost like Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, so kind of the individual at the center and then kind of outward circles there. And what she found was that it's a kind of ongoing acceptance and engagement piece when you bring a new piece of technology, and it's not just the end user who's got to accept and engage with that technology. Everyone across the cycle of it going into a person's house has to also accept and adopt and understand that piece of technology and then pass that to the next person. So if you think about social housing, what we did was we brought together a group of about 30 stakeholders. Within that, we had people from Welsh Government, we had a range of people who were in social housing, so people who were in like procurement in social housing, people who were in installation, in those teams who were organising the installation and being on the desk to speak to people about, I've got a question about this technology, and then tenant engagement people, as well as manufacturers. And we asked them to engage in this thing called value stream mapping, which basically takes a process from start to finish and all the different stakeholders, and they all demonstrate by writing in their colour, because this is my role, this is what I do, this is the context in which it sits, and this is how I pass my bit of information to whoever the next person is. And what you would hope, although in vain hope for almost anything that's like this, is that the people who are across that thing would be able to articulate that really cleanly. And what we found was that there were lots and lots of challenges associated with doing that. And the challenge is that if what you've got is people who are designing technology that isn't necessarily for the sector that it's going into, or for the end user that it's going into, they're just creating something that isn't for that, well, that instantly means that when you're procuring it, that changes the type of conversation that you're having there. And what you need to do is a piece of acceptance there to then pass it to the next person who's going to be the installer, and they need to understand these are all the benefits of this thing, this is how it's going to be used, this is how we're going to monitor the data, and they pass it to the next person. But the reality is, like, all of these people are in really fast-paced, difficult jobs. They're not all necessarily tech experts. They're not all necessarily people who are living and breathing and real enthusiasts around this stuff. And it's therefore a complicated thing to take from start to finish. And where you've got, at the end of the process, then tenants who say, look, I don't know what this thing is, or how I use it, or how I engage with it. It's to some degree unsurprising, because it's been through this, diluted. And I think there's a problem. I think from my perspective, what I'd like to do with that is, once we've got to the bottom of that data and we really know what's in it, is to then start thinking about, okay, well, what are the points where you could intervene from a psychological perspective, and you could say, you need to have this conversation, and that's going to help this next bit go along, or you need to find ways of making sure that information carries on in a way that takes the value with it. So that's kind of where we've got to with that. It's pretty early stages, but I think there's a kind of interesting set of social dynamics that may well enhance people's general happiness to have new pieces of technology in their house at the end.
I can imagine at an academic level that's quite a complex thing to do, but I suppose a lot of practitioners in the built environment are already doing that day to day. Are there some kind of basic 101 stuff that people should be trying to think about psychologically when it comes to adoption of anything? So if you're like you say, local housing officer, or you're a procurement specialist, or you're a project manager for a particular rollout of retrofit or something, and you're starting to introduce a new thing or a new way of doing something to a group of people, are there some basic go-tos that people should be thinking? Because I imagine there's a lot of that going on all the time. And I joked yesterday, somebody else on the podcast said there's more pilots in social housing than there are in British Airways. And it's true, there's so much going on all the time in housing. But there's probably not a lot of people like you engaged in those processes. And then we keep getting to the end of a lot of this stuff and wondering why nobody understands why they don't like the heat pumps we've put in. Like, what don't they understand? We gave them a one-page leaflet when we installed it.
I think, some of there's not loads and loads of evidence out there in terms of social housing. We ran a systematic review. We found not many papers really that was specifically looking at the intersection of new technologies in social housing. And I'm particularly interested in that intersection because of the choice and agency that you maybe don't have in social housing. It's not me going, I'm going to go and find the funds, apply for that pot of money, and go and decide that I am going to, off my own back, put this piece of technology in. It's the Housing Association has gone, in Wales via the Optimised Retrofit Programme, they've gone, we've accessed this, which means we can do this bit of retrofit work for this area or community or streets or whatever. So I'm really interested in that particular combination of factors. I think there's a lot to unpack there.
Because the other one is more of a purchasing. Somebody's arriving at a decision to adopt something commercially.
I guess there are a lot fewer stages between the kind of like the product and the person, aren't there? If you're choosing it yourself, and that actually what you're doing is kind of sandwiching in so many other kind of people who've made these decisions for you. And as you're saying as well, in terms of the level of agency, if you are having something kind of you've been told that you have to have something in social housing versus if you are choosing as an owner-occupier to buy it because you believe in it?
There's a few things to unpack there. I think where you look at the evidence that is out there in terms of like people who've done this because they've decided to, well, it's in their identity.
Yes.
It's who they are. Like they wanted to do it. They were interested in it. They could see that it's important. They think it's valuable enough to spend money on. Yeah. Of course, they're going to be more inclined to adopt it. They're enthusiasts. Yeah. Whereas in social housing, like, and I wouldn't want to kind of suggest that what's happening is that people are forcing technology on people. That's not really what's happening. What is happening though is if you're in the social housing sector, if your housing is provided by a social housing landlord, over the next 10 years, it's going to be pretty much unavoidable that you go into a house that doesn't have this, because where there are voids, they're retrofitting those voids primarily. So I think, you know, in terms of key things to think about, I think really you can wrap this up in all manner of different ways. From a psychological perspective, there are a load of predictors that would make it more likely that someone would engage with technology. Things like their own sense of capability. How much do I feel I could control and use and engage with this technology? That'll be a predictor. The opportunity, the amount of opportunity and time that they've got is likely to be a predictor. Their motivation, do I think it's good? Do I think it's valuable? They're all predictors of behaviour.
Is there a health impact? You know,
is there a health impact? There's if you look at things like you taught to, which is a different kind of theoretical model, there's things like perceived ease of use. Does it seem easy? Hedonic pleasure, is it nice to use? Does it look rubbish and is it horrible on my wall, or does it look nice and can I, you know, that bit where, you know, you unlock your phone and it makes that nice click and a little tiny vibrate in your hand? That's hedonic pleasure, right? It's like, oh, that's really nice.
Your dopamine hit.
That's what you're right. So there's all manner of ways in which you can do that. But fundamentally, I think the thing that is likely the biggest predictor here is, what do people who are like me think about it? What do my neighbours and my family and my friends and the community that I live in, do they see this as a broadly positive thing? And I think where there are papers, there's a paper last year came out looking at ORP specifically in social housing. I think it was done in Swansea. Good tenant engagement is the key like driver. It's where the person who's engaged with those tenants knows the tenants, is engaged with them, has worked with them. I think really that's probably going to be one of the major ways that this becomes adopted is people who I perceive as being like me are on board.
Yeah, that's interesting.
If I may, so I was having a chat with Gráinne McGill, who put the last 2 days, fantastic days together, just giving a quick shout out for Gráinne. And she was just saying, and we were talking about the differences between architecture and medicine and how we approach particularly new studies, research studies. And I was explaining that whenever we do that, we tend to start, well, we should definitely be starting, it does not always happen, but we tend to start with patient engagement at the very beginning. So that's how you design your research questions. It's how you design your interventions if you're doing a trial. So you take it at the beginning and go, before you start to do any of the rest of the stuff, is you make sure that your priorities are aligned with the people who's going to impact the most, and that the interventions that you're thinking about are acceptable. And she was saying that actually, in terms of some of the built environment interventions, that has historically, and I'm sorry if I'm maybe talking out of turn, but historically that has been a kind of nice to have at the end of quite a lot of work, rather than being an integral part of pilots or kind of rollouts from the beginning. And it sounds like that is, you know, kind of that would really help. And as I say, this is not my area, so if that's already done.
No, but I think that's the beauty of multidisciplinary kind of approaches, is that, you know, one of the I don't know if it's a trope from the medical world, but the assumption from the built environment is that there's a lot of feedback loops in medicine. Like there's a lot of self-criticism and post-evaluation of outcomes and reflection and re-evaluation, you know, and there's a lot of that goes on. And there's almost none of that in construction.
Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, it really is, you know, we like to build something and then run away as fast as we possibly can and never look back. So like, I think there's some elements in that. How do you navigate, particularly at the professional end of things, this critical feedback loop of the outcomes of what we're doing to improve and reiterate and nudge and all of the things that enable us to make the right decisions. Because construction is a little bit like medicine. It's quite conservative and can be quite cautious and slow moving, because there's a lot of risk and money wrapped up in stuff and liability, obviously. And, you know, assets have always been more highly valued than life, generally speaking. So they're very cautious about being associated with that kind of a risk. But you don't see any of the level of stuff that you see in medicine of review boards and where there's failures, how you break that down and learn, and that you can fail in medicine and have a process that improves, learns from it. Whereas the failure in construction, unless it's catastrophic and happens at a regulatory level, you don't seem to see that self-learning.
So I mean, we, at the simplest level, we have so much of that built in on a day-to-day, and this is talking outside of research now, this is just talking on the wards. If, for example, somebody maybe writes down the wrong dose of a drug, so even if it isn't given, that will be flagged up as, you know, as a near miss. It goes into you collect all of these near misses in a blame-free culture, and that's really important. And I think we have got to a point, it's taken some years, but I think we have got to a point where people are now, oh, okay, fine, you know, I'll just fill that in about myself. I'm just going to fill this form in about myself. I wrote this route down wrong. This is what happened. And then you can actually look at the infrastructure underneath that's allowed that to happen, do you know?
Yeah, my wife's a nurse. Often she comes back late and I go, oh, what happened? The drug trolley, there was a mix-up on this, so I've had to fill out a load of forms at the end of the day to kind of...
And it's a pain.
There's 5 near misses.
It's a pain, but it really helps with the kind of the systems level learning. And I think once you can get beyond that level of caution or kind of like self-preservation and worries about blame, that there's just so much to learn from failing, and to, you know, that. But the other thing that you were saying there in terms of just not historically, not the construction industry not being good at going back and looking to see how things have happened. Maybe now we're more aware of the health outcomes that come from some of those interventions that have been made. That there's a much stronger argument for that to have to happen, almost in the way of there would be if I was doing a trial of a drug. Do you know?
Yeah.
So now that we know about the health and housing links, we know how much we're aware of that strength, that actually there is an ethical obligation to go back and to investigate what has happened, what the health outcomes have been, not just the...
And we're definitely we're moving into an environment where we've got performance data sets on buildings for the first time, you know, smart meters, studies that have looked at it. We were talking in the workshop this morning about the lack of ventilation data that's out there at the moment. So, but you know, those gaps are being filled that perhaps aren't there in some other disciplines, and I think as we have more of a rich data set to look and correlate performance with outcomes, that critical nature, because so far mostly it's been anecdotal out of the built environment, and we tend to run buildings to failure. And we tend to fix stuff when we can afford it, and as part of programs we're not critically looking at the performance of buildings and adjusting and iterating.
So I find that so surprising. I find that really, and as you're saying, kind of like, asking for kind of thoughts as an outsider, I find that staggering, just because that is completely at odds with everything that I have grown up with. Do you know?
I'm in it, and I find it. I mean, you know, it's one of the biggest assets we own as human beings, as our home or the buildings that we manage and so on. So they're hugely important structures in our life, financial investments in time and resources, and yet we know almost nothing about them. Whereas lower down the echelon, something like a car, for years we've been recording data on accidents. You take your car into a mechanic's, they plug it into a computer, that's used to diagnose problems, but that data's going back to the manufacturer to help them improve the product statistically. That same data's going to the government from the so we've been, and that's just something that's worth 20 to 50 grand, never mind the value of a home or an office building and so on. And that, so the level of data, so we were joking 10 years ago, wouldn't it be nice to be able to walk up to a house, plug a USB in to a laptop and have a look at the performance of the building? Yeah. Like the fact that we weren't there 10 years ago and we were doing that with cars was bananas then. And so but that's changing. And I think that, I say often on this show that data from the built environment changes everything, because it changes the narrative, changes the framing, changes the agency. People are in possession of the facts and are able to make decisions in buildings in ways that they haven't been able to in the past. And part of that is the evolution of the technology. You know, we've got environmental sensors that we can use that weren't. We were joking earlier about wheeling suitcases of data loggers in to understand basic provisions. Now you just go around sticking them on walls and they connect via mobile phone signals and you're away. You know, it's really interesting.
Just what you're saying there just reminded me of something. We work with a fantastic group of parents from across Scotland who are living in kind of underheated or hard to heat homes, and one of them really wisely said, "So data is just what makes the invisible visible." And I was like, yes, I'm writing that down. That's exactly what it is. And it's the same thing, isn't it? It's moving from anecdotes to evidence, and it's a way of, I always talk about it as storytelling with numbers, and just that is, it's what, as you're saying, the ventilation data is missing, and there are lots of other things that are missing, but we're slowly getting there. Yeah.
I was involved in a very interesting project years ago in Thamesmead. It was called the Thamesmead Damp, Mould and Condensation, CDM project. And one of the interesting outcomes of that was the very early days of sensor data from social housing. It was a switchy product, which you might know the product. And one of the things that it enabled the housing officers to do was to go to the home with the data from the home and have a context-based discussion with the homeowners about how to manage heating and condensation risk in their home. They were able to see whether those interventions made a difference, and when they went back, able to have another in-context conversation. And it changed everything, the framing of everything, and it meant some more. And it reminded me of something you said earlier. And we had a guy on podcast about this time last year called Dan Hyde, and he's a UX expert, a user experience expert. His company is called Everything is User Experience, which is really apt. But we don't bring the user, the stakeholder, into these conversations enough. You're doing it with your heat project, and you do it all the time with the work that you do. That seems to be a big gap to me, and I imagine you must see that looking in to the built environment of we build buildings for people. Where are the people in this conversation? I think like we've had 2 days of a conference here, and there hasn't been any users in that conversation, which is very typical. I mean, it's not the fault of this, but like, who's missing from these conversations?
I completely agree with you, and I think like that's one of the things that we, as fairly new to housing, as a group of psychologists, we've found that hard to bring people. So we've put these events on, and we've done these things, and we've invited tenants, and we just thought this would be great. Everyone will turn up, the tenants will be there. But I think part of this is where you are trying to engage with tenants is doing it on their terms, on their turf. And so one of the things we're doing next week, I think, is going out into a community in the community hall where they are, and talking to them about some of the tech acceptance stuff, and trying to extend it, because I think reflecting on our own research, we found it really hard to engage tenants in the way that we've tried to so far. So like part of it is switching up and being much more proactive in terms of making sure we do get that, because
and I think you've hit the nail on the head with another thing there, in terms of, we've been talking recently about the terminology of groups who are hard to reach, and trying to relabel them as easy to ignore. And actually, so for example, the families that we're working with on the project that I'm doing at the moment, classically, if you want a group of patients or public to be involved in the research study, you put out an advert somewhere buried on a university website, and you get kind of retired professors and people who, fancy an Amazon voucher, and they're not representative. And no offence to my colleagues, but they're often not representative of the people that you're trying to target. So in this situation, it was we didn't want to do it that way. So we kind of did lots of different things, but kind of through Poverty Alliance, through Energy Saving Trust, through word of mouth, through one of my holidays to Lewis, kind of these kind of things, and then peer kind of person to person, have you heard about this? So it's not just about kind of people not coming, but it's about it's not hard to reach. It's easy to know. You know that, I know that, but actually if you just want bums on seats, you'll end up with the wrong people, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, totally. And there's a massive science to citizen engagement, citizen science stuff. That's Sarah West on from the Stockholm Institute, and there's all these different levels of engagement, and right the way from the kind of people that go and count birds on a Saturday weekend morning, one April morning.
That is me.
As and all the way to the public actually being involved in writing the research question, like at a very fundamental question, and that kind of level of engagement. And I think professionals are very nervous about bringing the general public into their world when that's exactly what they should be doing, because you feel like you're losing control. And yes.
But brilliant, but you should do, because we need to cede some of that control, as you were saying earlier on, about autonomy and about control, and that these are not our research topics, these are people's lives. So actually having them in from the beginning is, I don't understand why you wouldn't. So
what's been your kind of general perspective as interlopers into the built environment, kind of looking in at the kind of the engineers and the aerosol scientists and the U value and
what's a U value?
Fluid dynamics and all of this kind of stuff. What have you seen as that? I mean, it's interested you enough that you've turned up to these types of things and are getting engaged. So you see some potential in us somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I would completely agree. I mean, like, some of the terminology is impenetrable. You kind of, as an engaged outsider, you're just kind of clinging on to some of the conversations, going,
but I don't understand.
Yeah. It sounds good, but I don't know. And I think there's a reality that probably reflects then as you go forward, right? So there's definitely something around finding a communal language for everyone in that thing, and it's hard. And obviously, everything's kind of culturally bound, and you'd have a medical language, and I've got a psychological language, and you've got a built environment language. But if we're going to try and come together in a truly multidisciplinary way, then we probably do need to try and find ways of talking at least on the same terms. And I think that's quite one of my takeaways.
Although I don't know whether you found the same, but I actually find it really liberating, because you kind of go in, you go, I don't understand. Can you just talk to me like I'm a 5-year-old? And you can't do that in most other parts of your life, can you?
True.
But actually you can go, oh, sorry, I'm the token medic or whatever. And actually you can ask the stupid questions, and sometimes that's quite insightful, because if you are coming at it with completely fresh eyes and you're kind of asking things which are dogma, or which kind of haven't really been thought about, sometimes that's helpful. But I find it quite liberating.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And there's something about also kind of articulating something that is almost automatic in the way you talk about it. So it's so ingrained that it's, when you say, no, don't just use the term, explain it to me. It makes people think slightly differently sometimes about what they really mean about that. I mean, we were doing some training with a housing association a few months ago, and one of the things we were asking them to do is to kind of reflect on how they would have dealt with this simulated scenario that we put them in. And they wrote down their responses, and they fired off, we would do this and 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 this. And then when you look at it and you go, as a kind of relative outsider to that, you go, that's unbelievably impressive that you've done all of that stuff. And we kind of made them unpack all of the layers and all of the decisions and all of the ways they had to kind of consider that. And it's amazing.
That being almost at brainstem level for them.
It's amazing once you take it out of that just communal shared language, what it does to the way people talk about things. And I think that's probably part of the rationale for, as liberating as it is, finding ways to
disrupt it.
Yeah.
A little bit. The other thing I would say, and I hope that you've felt the same, is just that I've been involved in lots of different kind of areas of bits and pieces over my career. I find this area incredibly collaborative, really cohesive and socially minded, and I feel like I've come home. Do you know? I feel like I'm surrounded by all these people. I don't speak exactly the same language as them, but I just feel that it's a corner of work and research which is really aimed at making the world a better place. I really believe that people, everybody is just so nice. They're really nice, and we've all got a similar kind of outlook on what we want to achieve, even though we've got different ideas of how to do it. So yeah, I think that I would definitely say that about as an outsider.
For the corporate listeners, that's mission driven.
Sorry. Oh no.
Do good stuff because it's good.
Yeah.
If you start saying let's circle back, I'm going to leave.
Circle back. This is mission driven. Yeah. Blue sky thinking. I think what's really interesting for me about this multidisciplinary angle is that it puts you in a much better position to tell the stories. Yeah. And it's storytelling that breaks barriers and boundaries and makes change. It's being able to put things in a way, bring the complex down to a level where we can tell stories and build heroes and villains and missions and challenges in a way that people can reflect and understand that. And storytelling and communication is such an important part of what we're doing, because nobody has the time to be even a minor expert in half the stuff that we look at. They've got other shit to do, and the only way that we're going to be able to resonate with people at a fundamental level, I think personally, is through stories. Being able to, like you say, can I see myself and my community in what I'm being told here? Can I see myself using this product? Or like my teenagers, and unless it's an iPhone, they're not interested. They've got to see themselves in this journey, and we'll only do that through stories and association. Yeah,
definitely. And I think I maybe was chatting to you earlier on about trying to make the information accessible to every stakeholder. So I'm running an event tomorrow which was supposed to be a small event and it's kind of grown arms and legs, and we've now got 130 folk from 50 different organisations with all sorts of different expertise, and some are from academia, some are from policy, some are industry, third sector, public sector, you name it. And everybody there has got their own little pocket of expertise. And one of the ways that we were like, right, well, how are we going to make this, how are we going to make this accessible to everybody? Because there's loads of stuff like U values, that a quarter of the folk won't have ever heard of. So one of the things we're doing is we've got a graphic illustrator to do real-time illustration of the high-level points of what's happening in each of the talks, so that you can follow it in different ways. You can either listen to what they're saying, you can look at the presenter slides, or you can look at this real-time kind of beamed up onto the screen, and it's in a cartoon because I'm a paediatrician, but it was great. So, but actually trying to find different ways, not just saying, okay, well, we speak different languages, but that's another way, I suppose, of you saying trying to find a communal language, isn't it? It's just to try and to bring it down to the simplest bits and to make it as accessible to everybody as possible, with nobody being embarrassed to ask the silly questions. So, but yeah.
Well, look, it's gone 3. I'd say with the days that you've had, you probably deserve a little lie down at the very least.
If only.
Zone out on the train, look at your phone for a couple of hours. Dan, Livy, thanks so much for coming in and chatting to you. I think it's been really refreshing conversation. Thanks a million.
Not at all.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Before you go, can I ask a favour? If you enjoyed the podcast and know someone else that might enjoy it too, do spread the word and let's keep building this community. The podcast was brought to you in partnership with Eurovent, Aico, Aereco, Ultra Protect, 21 Degrees and InBiot. All great companies who share the vision of this podcast, and your support of them helps them support this show. Do check them out in the show notes at airqualitymatters.net, and do also check out the YouTube channel by the same name, with loads of extra content appearing on there weekly. Thanks a million. See you again next week.